Wache anin Alethea Nadishnakas. My name is Alethea Pezzo, and I'm of mixed Italian, Cree, and Ojibwe ancestry. I'm from Missinaibi Cree First Nation, but I was born and raised in Toronto, where I received my bachelor's degree in Indigenous Studies and Political Science. From there, I worked in various roles at the municipal, provincial, and First Nation community levels. I'm excited today to bring forward Wahkohtowin's 4-part webinar series that seeks to revisit policy from a perspective that honors Indigenous rights and worldviews. For those who do not know, Wahkohtowin is an Indigenous-led and First Nation-owned social enterprise that works towards creating nationhood pathways to ensure sustainability and harmony within our lands, our people, and our livelihood for the next 7 generations. Let's begin a quick round of introductions. I'll pass the torch to my colleagues, and I encourage everyone to type your responses into the chat box below. Who are you? Where are you from? And where are we going? These are important questions we must be able to answer with confidence as individuals, as a community, and finally as a nation. Wahkohtowin believes that these big questions are part of our ancestral responsibility to pass down our knowledge and empower our descendants to carry it within themselves. Unfortunately, colonialism has stolen, hidden, erased, and filled in the answers for themselves. And the reason they've stolen our ability to answer these questions for ourselves is because it limits our imaginations for a future without oil and gas, a future where colonialism never ends. This way of thinking does not benefit us, and it only benefits colonizers, descendants of those colonizers, and settlers who stole the land and our people, but only if we agree that this is the way it is and this is the way it always will be. As a disclaimer, throughout this presentation, I will be posing a lot of bigger questions which may not be easily answered. I'm not suggesting that I have all the answers. I'm simply seeking to share my understandings as I am constantly thinking about the tangled web of colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy in my everyday life and dreaming of ways to uplift my community and my nation out of it. So whether you come to your own conclusions or share in mine, I want us to start a sacred fire dialogue about indigeneity, traditional governance systems, nationhood, rights, and climate justice beyond the usual constraints of colonialism that limit our understanding of the past and thus our imaginings for the future. And it's important that we start this dialogue now to develop a shared collective vision for the future. So when revisiting and decolonizing policy, we must begin with the simple task of defining it. So what is policy? Policy is often mistaken for neutrality and objectivity when it's simply defined as a set of rules or a plan of action for a group of people, organization, business, government, or political party. And this simple definition fails to capture the violence and harm policy causes to Indigenous peoples. Whether a policy is good or bad, successful or unsuccessful, depends on the eyes of the colonizer. This is because policy is a colonial term and tool of Canada to serve their agenda. Historically, it placed Indigenous people as objects for experimentation, for manipulation, and for eventual extinction, instead of holding Indigenous people as people with rights and valuable knowledge. This is because colonial ways of seeing, thinking, and doing takes what it wants without regard to relational accountability. Whereas Indigenous worldviews follow a circular approach that embodies respect, relevancy, reciprocity, and relationality at every step of the process. And these are the standards of Indigenous relational accountability we adhere to in the work we do at Wahkohtowin. It is through these 4 R's that we dismantle the harm around policy and translate words into meaningful action. Please keep this in mind as we move forward with the presentation. So policy is impossible to define without also defining colonialism. Michelle Good, in her truth-telling book, aptly defines colonialism as the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. While I do not know the word for policy in my own language, since I don't speak the same language my great-grandmother spoke, I know it's difficult to translate Indigenous worldviews and concepts into English. For example, I learned during Wahkohtowin's birch bark canoe build, Wigwasi Chimon, that it does not mean canoe, but rather a spirit-carrying vessel. It does not mean that we didn't have the language to describe something that translates words into action, which is something Canada consistently fails to do in its policy implementations. So the Indian Act is a well-known example of how policy harms Indigenous people, and it is part of the Decolonial Toolkit, meaning a collection of legislatives that are used to achieve the goals of colonialism. For those who do not know, I will briefly explain the Indian Act. It was born in 1876, and it is a collection of paternalistic, racist, sexist, oppressive policies that were meant to solve the Indian problem, where Indian became wards of the state and slowly assimilated into the broader settler society over time. It is a policy that embodies the worldview of the colonizers. It is also around the same time that many Indigenous nations entered into treaty with Canada, including Missinaibi, Chapleau, and Brunswick House, to protect and reaffirm their rights, known as the Number Treaties. However, Canada had already become aware of gold, diamond, and other mineral deposits on Omushkewak territory and had laid out the framework to dismantle our governance and nation through the Indian Act. The Indian Act was created to remove us from our lands, to disconnect us from our culture, ceremonies, language, relationships, and identity, to dismantle our governance institutions, to dismember our families and communities, and to disempower us from making decisions about our future, our lands and territories, and to protect the next 7 generations. As we explore the policy timeline to see what's in our decolonial toolkit and how they were created, we can confidently say the Indian Act is not part of it. It has always been protested and criticized by Indigenous people since its creation. While the biggest reforms occurred after World War II, it has done little to reverse its harmful legacy, which continues today. I encourage everyone to read 21 Things You Did Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph to learn in more detail how it was amended multiple times to suit the colonial agenda. This poses more questions such as, why is the Indian Act so hard to dismantle? Why did the biggest changes occur after World War II? And what will replace the Indian Act? These are very much real questions today for those who live under it, and for First Nations beginning to recognize their inherent right to self-determination and self-governance. It will take over 100 years for Canada to create policy that aims to reverse the harmful legacy of the Indian Act, and perhaps even longer for Canada to take action that reconciles the nation-to-nation relationship. What is policy reform? This is almost impossible to describe without also describing Indigenous acts of protest and resistance. While policy itself is not a radical source of change-making, we begin to see a shift in Canadian policy from assimilation and removal to termination to So how did we go from assimilation policies to self-determination policies within Canada? Why did we go from the Indian Act to UNDRIP? We do not have the full time to explain the full policy timeline, but in short, it is the result of brave acts of resistance from previous and current generations who believed in fulfilling the eighth fire prophecy and who recognized their responsibilities to protect the land. From Standing Rock to Wet'suwet'en, Indigenous land and water defenders understood Indigenous rights may be trampled by colonialism and their policies, but they are never fully extinguished as they are inherently connected to the land. There is a rise of First Nations and Indigenous people returning to their original laws and policies, especially during times when colonial states are trying to build illegal pipelines on unceded native land, as they recognize that it's an attempt to erode our inherent right to self-determination and self-governance. Thus, my heart and prayers are forever with Indigenous people around the world who gather to fight, protect, and defend the earth for the next 7 generations. Wahkohtowin believes every act of resistance is an act of love from one generation to the next. Every pipeline thwarted is an act of love, every drumbeat is an act of resistance, and every statue of John A. Macdonald being torn down is an act of harm reduction. This is all to say that without the perseverance, persistence, determination, and love from previous generations, we wouldn't be where we are today. And without the work of the current and next generations, we won't move ahead. Earlier, I mentioned the eighth fire prophecy, and I will briefly explain for those who do not know. The eighth fire prophecy speaks of a time where, after 7 generations of conflict, everyone will come together to build a harmonious relationship. It also warns of a divided path and a choice we must make to heal the land and people. If we are to rebuild our communities and nations, we must also rebuild our relationship to the land. And build sustainable economies, as everyone needs to work together to share the gifts and responsibilities of the land. To know where we are going and how we're going to use the policy tools to rebuild our nation and communities, we must revisit the eighth fire prophecy. While I am not a knowledge keeper and I do not view online platforms as the best way to share this prophecy, I want to share this quote from Robin Kimmerer's book called Braiding Seagrass that mentions it. As prophecies serve as warnings and describe what eventually become history. Currently, we are at a crossroads. All the people of the earth must choose between 2 paths. One where the earth is scorched black and the other is grassy and leads to life. It warns of a choice that we all must make, but it also warns that if we do not make the choice, someone else will make it for us. This is another question we must be able to ask and answer with confidence, which is, will you help ignite the eighth fire prophecy? As we move forward in the policy timeline to see how the development of the policy tools in our Decolonial Healing Toolkit, we must remember every nation is starting at different points in the decolonial healing process. It is not linear, but rather a long process to move away from a place of hurt, anger, loss, and grief towards a place where everyone is thriving. Nobody starts at the same point, and I've often heard it takes 7 generations to truly heal as a family from Indian Act residential schools. So how many generations until we are healed as a community, as a nation? This is not a small task. However, with the right tools, it becomes more manageable. So what's within our Decolonial Toolkit? The next webinar in the series will explore the policies within our toolkit, or rather our sacred bundle. The Red and White Paper is a great example of how protest led to the creation of one of the first policy tools in our toolkit. Post-World War II, there was a huge rise in concerns about the disparaging gaps of quality of life between Canadians and Indigenous people. In response, Prime Minister Elliott Trudeau and the Minister of Indian Affairs proposed the 1969 White Paper, which aimed to terminate the distinction between First Nations people and Canadians, abolishing the Indian Act and passing responsibilities to the province. It was severely criticized by those who could see the true intentions beyond the thinly disguised assimilation attempt to get rid of the Indian and thus their treaty responsibilities. In response, the Indian Association of Alberta published Citizens Plus, which became known as the Red Paper. It was presented to the Prime Minister and his cabinet alongside drumming and singing on Parliament Hill, where it was formally rejected in 1970. While it is not unusual nowadays to see Indigenous people dance in full regalia, drum, or speak in their language on Parliament Hill, it was extremely unprecedented at the time. Despite being forbidden under the Indian Act to form political groups, hire lawyers, vote in elections, Indigenous political activism was alive and well. This demonstrates the level of strength and conviction of Indigenous rights activists who are rooted in their legal traditions, culture, and language, which in itself is an act of resistance. This singular act launched a dramatic increase in political activism that eventually led to Indigenous rights being entrenched into the Canadian Constitution. In 1982, Indigenous and treaty rights were entrenched into Canada's Constitution of Rights and Freedoms under Section 35. As a result of Indigenous rights activists using policy and culture. While Indigenous and treaty rights are vaguely defined in this legal policy document, it spurred decades of lawsuits launched by First Nations seeking to protect and assert their rights, which were being violated by Canada. Unfortunately, it is almost a decade later when the Oka crisis arises in 1992, where our 78-day standoff occurred between Mohawk protectors and the Canadian military when a golf course expansion encroached onto the sacred burial grounds. When the Canadian court system failed, they used barricades and other means to stop development. And as a response to the Oka crisis, Canada produced another policy tool. The Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, which is a policy born from Canada's failure to honor the treaties. RCAP's mandate is extremely comprehensive and broad. It has over 440 recommendations and is over 4,000 pages long. It looks at every aspect of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples' lives under colonialism. RCAP encapsulates the collective grief and pain from the loss of land, culture, languages, and other spheres alongside the various voices from Indigenous women, elders, youth, community leaders as guidelines to bridging the gap between Indigenous and Canadian quality of life. RCAP requires $30 billion investments over 20 years to rebuild our economic, social, cultural, legal, and health institutions to create healthy individuals, which make up a healthy community and thus a healthy nation, on par with our treaty partner. This is called reconciliation. Canada spent 6 years and $55 million to commission this report. However, RCAP quickly faded from the Canadian public attention within months. Thus, the Assembly of First Nations held a national day of protest in response to the lack of action, which resulted in Canada producing the RCAP Action Plan in 1998 that did not achieve its mandate, and thus a following progress report card following the 10-year anniversary of RCAP in 2006, which revealed that Canada did not achieve much process in reconciliation. How much longer will we wait for Canada, and how much longer will Canada spend money? During this period, there is a switch from Canada's federal Liberal government to a Conservative government. In 2006, Prime Minister Harper formally apologizes to residential school survivors and their families. But at the same time, Canada's words do not match their actions, as the Conservative government rejected the $30 billion investment and responded with a funding cap. The legacy of RCAP lives in its groundbreaking legal implications as a resource for First Nations to assert their rights in the Canadian legal system. And it is the framework for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, born in 2011, which builds upon its 440 recommendations in its 92 calls to action. Only 13 out of the 92 calls to action were completed. And we see that the first mass grave uncovering in Kamloops spurred most of Canada's action. So both these policies are ambitious, but they are possible to achieve, and both these policies strongly recommend implementation of UNDRIP. After years of lack of meaningful action from Canada, Indigenous people were not satisfied with incremental changes, and thus the I Don't Know More movement was born in 2012. The all-female founders deployed various tactics to gain national attention using social media campaigns, hunger strikes, National Day of Protest, series of teach-ins, states of emergencies declared, flash traditional dance mobs, dance circles, road and railway blockades, in order to raise awareness and concerns about other policies and colonial justices. The founders explored another avenue where Canadians hold their governments accountable to their promises. It was during this time period that Prime Minister Harper and his government were constantly criticized as a threat to Indigenous sovereignty. Fast forward to 2008, where we have the creation of the Colonial Accord, which is the result of years of advocacy between Indigenous leaders and Canadian leaders who gathered for 18 months in Kelowna, British Columbia. It was developed to be a 10-year plan with an initial 5-year funding agreement that pledged $5.1 billion over 5 years to assist Indigenous communities with housing and infrastructure, education, economic opportunities, and healthcare to bridge the quality of life. It could have been the roadmap to achieving real change through policy making while improving Canadian and Indigenous relationships, as it achieves something that is rare in policy. There is a sense among Indigenous leaders that meaningful consultation had occurred to create this mutually beneficial policy. However, it was quickly abandoned by the new Conservative majority government, resulting in more years of policy stagnation and socio-economic decay that further deteriorated this nation-to-nation relationship. In 2007, we have the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, with 42 articles relating to the individual and collective rights of Indigenous people around the world. It is the most comprehensive international instrument to recognizing Indigenous rights, relating to self-determination, free prior informed consent, development, conservation and protection of lands and territories, preservation of language and cultures, amongst other rights. It took 30 years of United Nations negotiating with Indigenous people around the world, and more accurately, it is the result of centuries of global Indigenous activism in both domestic and international arenas. Unfortunately, Canada initially voted against it, but then later adopted it as an aspirational document in 2010, as it would not trump domestic law. The first attempt to legislate UNDRIP into Canadian law was from MP Romero Saganash, who introduced his bill, an act to ensure that the laws of Canada are in harmony with the United Nations. It was defeated in Parliament, and it wasn't until 2016 where Canada fully endorsed UNDRIP. However, implementation gaps remain. In 2019, the Conservative Party was accused of stalling tactics for Bill C-62, and on the 10th anniversary of UNDRIP, NAN called for UNDRIP to be implemented across all federal and provincial laws. In most recent development, in June 2023, Canada releases its draft UNDRIP action plan. Despite the lack of new funding agreements and the non-committal language, and the calls for more consultation with Indigenous leaders. It remains unclear if Canada will implement any of its self-determination policies. So what is needed to transform Canada's apologies and words into action? Well, if time, resources, and political will are the necessary ingredients to transform those into meaningful action, then we do not need to reinvent the wheel every generation with policies that regurgitate the same recommendations. Canada lacks the political will, but Indigenous people have the most fortified will to achieve change within our lifetimes. As Canada keeps throwing money at its problem, which is similar to a person giving spare change to someone experiencing houselessness, which does nothing to address the structural root causes of someone's suffering. Unfortunately, we do not have the time for Canada to implement these self-determination policies. And as we can see that they have no trouble implementing the Indian Act, but they continually fail to implement these policies that support Indigenous governance and determination. So, how does Wahkohtowin implement policy that aligns with Indigenous worldviews and honors Indigenous rights? Can policy serve our decolonial needs? To answer this, there is a common phrase often spoken amongst Indigenous policy analysts, which is, nothing for us and nothing without us, as policy can serve as a tool for our decolonial needs only when it is created by and for Indigenous peoples. Often policy is viewed as nameless and faceless. However, I want to remind everyone that it is people who are behind policy. Thus, it's important to know who creates the policy, where did it come from, and what path will it take us on. When analyzing the usefulness of policy for our Decolonial Toolkit, we must remember nothing for us, nothing without us. Meaning no policy should be decided by any representative without the full and direct participation of members of the groups affected by that policy. Wahkohtowin aims to be initiators of policy change instead of policy subjects, as the work we do embodies the interconnectedness of the land, economy, culture, and governance. Wahkohtowin sees value in RCAP, UNDRIP, and the lessons from the Colonial Accord as guiding tools and sources of policy leverage when interacting with Canadian governments, strengthening our traditional governance systems to share the gifts and responsibilities of the land while rebuilding a strong, resilient, sustainable economy for our First Nation stakeholders. With or without Canada's support, Wahkohtowin has the fortified will to implement these policies and are already doing the work to heal our communities, strengthen our economies, and build a resilient, sustainable future together. Wahkohtowin created its Strategic Action Plan and the Guardian Program Action Plan policies, which align with Indigenous worldviews and honor Indigenous rights in order to return to our homelands and traditional territory, to heal ourselves and our community, to create a healthy nation, to reconnect to culture, language, identity, community, and all our relations, to restore the Indigenous circular economy, to rebuild our governance, health, education, cultural, family, and legal institutions, to empower us to protect the earth for the next 7 generations. Wahkohtowin strongly believes that with every sweat lodge built, every drum made, every full moon ceremony, every sacred fire lit, we are moving towards a decolonial future where our children grow up proudly knowing who they are, where they come from, grounded in their culture and community, and connected to the land. That is the end of this presentation. Miigwech for everyone for listening, and I look forward to the second part of the webinar where we open up the floor to everyone. Miigwech.